outline what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to go into final disposition methods, talking about traditional burial, fire cremation, and bio-cremation, the process and environmental impacts that are associated with all of those, and then we'll dive into alkaline hydrolysis, the chemistry, the history, and then talk about our Portland facility. Go over the sampling and the pretreatment and the permitting that's associated with that, and then I'll just briefly talk about the new legislative in the state of Washington that has to do with composting. And then this last section is the more you know, is kind of a broader view of eco-friendly final disposition methods. So traditional ground burial is the most common method of final disposition, and it accounts for roughly half of all funeral rites. Some ancient cultures believe that ground burial helped the dead pass on to enter the underworld, and if the body wasn't buried correctly or deep enough, that it would come back to haunt them. Today in America, the tradition involves funeral home services, which include embalming, a casket, and burial in a vault at a cemetery. The remains are often wrapped in a plastic inside the casket. Excuse me. This method has the highest environmental impact, and it also consumes the most resources of any other funeral rite. Excuse me. Been fighting the cough all weekend. Embalming was popularized during the American Civil War, during Lincoln's farewell tour through 180 cities in 7 states. There was a French chemist that was on the tour staff to lower the rate of decomposition and keep Lincoln recognizable as people came to visit him. A body must be embalmed if the family is planning on having a viewing before final disposition. About 2.5 gallons of fluid are injected into the body through a major artery in the neck, pushing out the blood. The embalmer massages the body then to break up the circulatory clots to ensure the proper distribution of the fluid, followed by injections into thoracic, pelvic, and the abdominal area. If there is an autopsy, the organs are removed and treated with formaldehyde and then placed back inside the body. Embalming fluids also contain dyes that simulate the color of a person's natural skin tone, and the U.S. funeral industry consumes roughly about 5.3 million gallons annually, and it's estimated that 100 or 800,000 gallons of this chemical leach into the ground, which can affect surrounding soil and water ecosystems. Embalming is not required by law in most states if the burial is taking place within 2 days. And during fire cremation, the flames shoot down from the ceiling, which kind of help open up the skull, and it helps the process along so that the soft tissue is able to be incinerated. And it makes sense that that is kind of the hardest part of the body since it protects the precious brain. The operator also uses a rake to break up a body sometimes during the cycle to help things along. After the remains are picked free of metals and they're ground in a cremulator, in the bottom picture there is a picture of that cremulator. It's just kind of like a grinder. One traditional fire cremation uses enough fuel to take a 500-mile road trip, uses about 29 kilowatts hours of electricity, and it sends an average of 700 pounds of CO2 into the air. That includes vaporized heavy metals, dioxins, and halogenated hydrocarbons. Half of the metal in dental amalgam is mercury, and the rest is a combination of silver, tin, or copper. Removing mercury fillings from the body before cremation could decrease this, but many families are not comfortable with it because they view it as disfiguration. Installing emissions controls on crematorium smokestacks could also decrease the amount of mercury released, but that expense could push small operators out of business, and most funeral service businesses are small and family ran. The top picture there is dental metal, so we got everything from implants to fillings to screws and anything that might come out of the mouth, and the bottom is the remains after fire cremation. And the mercury vaporized during fire cremation eventually causes problems in water systems as it moves its way up the food chain in methylated form. Once vaporized, it will eventually fall out in the water system in one of 3 forms. The inorganic type mercury is the most common, but once in the water, it can be converted from one form to another. It can settle onto sediment, be buried, or methylated by sulfate-reducing bacteria. The methylated form is the most dangerous, and the one that can enter the food chain and cause environmental damage to organisms. Alkaline hydrolysis is a chemical reaction where a compound reacts with water to form new compounds. A strong base plus heat accelerates the process, and an elevated pressure prevents the boiling. The process breaks the chemical bonds that hold together proteins, fats, DNA, and other body building blocks. What's left is a liquid of simple organic molecules, kind of with a liquid soap consistency, and it smells a bit like the beach under a boardwalk. The process also breaks down toxic chemicals like embalming fluid, chemo drugs, and destroys disease-causing pathogens and prions. Fire cremation does not destroy pathogens completely or prions. The facility owner loves to demonstrate how sterile the effluent is by dipping his bare hand into it and rubbing it between his fingers and saying, "Look, it's sterile." And I think it's his litmus test for the squeamish because he does it on every tour that I take people on. So alkaline hydrolysis originated in the late 1800s as a way to turn dead livestock into fertilizer. The application evolved as a method for disposal of research animals that contained low level radioisotopes. At that time, it could cost over $150 just to dispose of one rabbit. Researchers Dr. Kane and Weber were the first to realize that they could discharge in liquid form to the drain, citing NRC standard 10 CFR 20. And then in 1990, Dr. Taguchi published findings on how to inactivate the causative agent in CGAG, which is Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, the human equivalent of mad cow, by soaking it in alkali followed by autoclaving. In 93, Dr. David Taylor experimented with the inactivation of prions, and that led to the use of hot alkalis as the most effective way to reliably destroy prions. And then in 95, there was a mad cow disease outbreak, and that just accelerated Taylor's work. And then during the period of 88 to 98, Britain was forced to slaughter almost 4.5 million cows during an outbreak. And then in 2005, the Mayo Clinic installed the first single human body digester unit to replace their traditional incinerator. In 2011, a funeral home in Florida makes alkaline hydrolysis commercially available cremation option. There are currently 19 states that allow bio-cremation, but most of them are research centers or vet hospitals, and they're not commercial facilities. Our Portland facility is one of 5 in the nation available to the public, and the only one like it in the Pacific Northwest. Mad cow disease, also known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, spread from feeding infected meat and bone meal to cattle. BSC lesions appear to be sponge-like under a microscope, and the incubation period is usually several years. It's a fatal neurological disease caused by a folded protein found abundantly in the nervous system. Eating contaminated meat or other products from cattle, excluding dairy products with BSC, is believed to be the cause of Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease in humans, because they share similar neuropathy and symptoms. So problems with muscle coordination, personality changes, impaired memory, vision issues, and eventually death. There's no cure, and most people decline rapidly within a year. Bio-cremation uses a combination of water and alkali and heat in a sealed digester chamber to break down organic material. It mimics a faster version of the natural decomposition process of a direct earth burial. The amount of alkali is based on the weight of the deceased, but the average sized person in our area requires roughly about 20 pounds of it. The ingredients are 95% alkali and 5% water. Potassium hydroxide and sodium hydroxide are the most common alkalis used in the process, and they're commonly found in cosmetics, body products, and food preparation. The deceased is then placed into a stainless steel perforated basket, as seen at the top left corner, which can accommodate up to about a 450-pound person. And then the basket is slid into the capsule where dry flake potassium hydroxide is added to the top of the body by the operator. The tank is sealed and then tips to a 45-degree angle while water is slowly added to the chamber and heated to about 300 degrees Fahrenheit, and then that's followed by gentle agitation. The operator actually describes it as a jacuzzi experience. And if you do a search for pictures of this unit, you will see every operator that owns one of these has this exact picture from the side. The heated water and alkali circulate over the body, breaking down the organic material, and the final solution is cooled and discharged with a co-flush of 80 gallons of water that is pumped to the holding tank. The system then does a rinse water cycle to clean the vessel with about 100 gallons of water, which is then discharged to the same holding tank. All that remains is a clean, mostly complete skeleton and an effluent composed of salts, fatty acids, and fragments of amino acids. The bone calcium phosphate is alkaline and it's not affected by the process. The liquefied organic material is drained to a holding tank for pH adjustment, and the bones are removed for drying in a separate oven for about an hour. The basket also catches all medical implants and metals where they are collected for recycling or disposal. Medical implants come out clean and most are in good enough shape to refurbish or recycle into another piece of equipment. Our Portland facility donates all of their medical implants to the Wounded Warriors Project so that they can be reused. Dental amalgam does not degrade and it emerges intact post bio-cremation process. And you can kind of see a hip joint in this photo where that little arrow is. It is kind of amazing just how clean they come out. It looks like they were never even put into somebody in the first place. The dried remains head to the grinding station where metals are removed via magnetic digging or picking, and then they're ground into a fine powder and returned to the family. There's actually 30% more remains returned to the family from bio-cremation and with fire. And the remains from fire cremation are grayish yellow color, as we are in that left picture. And the remains from bio-cremation are white in color. So the human body is made up of mostly water, fats, sugars, and nucleic acids and amino acids. Nucleic acids allow transfer of genetic information like DNA and RNA from organism to organism, and amino acids are the building blocks for proteins, which are simple organic compounds. The effluent is a sterile soap of liquid organics with a high pH of about 12 or 13 before pH adjustment. Each cycle produces less than 300 gallons of effluent per person. The effluent from our Portland facility has about 85% of it hauled off site and used as fertilizer for non-food crops. And the facility discharges the remaining amount in small batches of about 300 to 600 gallons every other month. The facility's goal is to have 100% of its effluent hauled for use as fertilizer. The form of phosphorus resulting from this process is not the form that causes nutrient loading in the form of runoff or bodies of water. Phosphorus in the form of calcium phosphate requires soil microbes to slowly release this bound form of nutrient for use by plants. Right, that's what should have been up while I was just speaking for those last 3 minutes. This is a little touchy. So at the time of the first sampling, the facility was using a combination of sodium hydroxide and potassium hydroxide for their alkali ingredient, and initial grab samples taken from the facility showed a really high BOD of about 56,000, TSS of 180, pH of 12.2, and really high zinc and copper. During the metal analysis, when the pH was brought down from adding the acid, the sample began to solidify, which raised concern over buildup and obstruction in the pipe and pump stations. Part of the reason the zinc and copper spike was so high was likely due to a combination of uneven concentrations in the sample as it began to solidify during the metals analysis, and the brass spigot at the facility sample port. It was observed by the lab that the sample was already starting to thicken as the pH lowered naturally while sitting in the lab before that acid was added for metals analysis. The industry normally discharged at around 9.5 or 10 pH, and mixing in the sewer with other waste streams would bring down the pH with saponification following, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And the site is actively processing 24/7, and it's very likely that your agency staff might see a body in transport or being prepared for cremation, so always keep that in mind when you're sending somebody to one of these sites. In the photo, the bottle on the right, that looks kind of like tea, is what it looked like before the metals analysis, and on the left is once they added some of the acid, you can kind of see it starting to re-solidify into small globules of fat. Saponification is a process by which triglycerides, a fat, are reacting with sodium or potassium hydroxide to produce glycerol and a fatty acid salt we know as soap. Lipids that contain fatty acid ester linkages can undergo hydrolysis. This reaction is catalyzed by a strong acid or base and sped up by adding heat. Sodium hydroxide is used more frequently due to its lower cost, but sodium hydroxide combined with a fatty acid produces a hard soap that is eventually going to cause buildup in pipes, sewers, and potentially clog lift stations, as demonstrated by the fluoride base. Using potassium hydroxide alone results in a soft soap. The compliance officer I spoke to about this case said that once the Florida funeral home had switched to just potassium hydroxide, they were no longer experiencing this problem in their lift stations. The KOH actually acted as a lubricant in the sewer and a beneficial detergent-like action within the pipes and lift stations. And just a little fun fact, past civilizations used to collect ashes from funeral pyres and make soap with it. And soap making is still popular to this day. Our course of action while working on a solution was to have the facility stop discharging, haul excess wastewater off-site using a licensed provider, thoroughly clean the tank, and then install a mixer to aid in the pH adjustment and decrease stratification. Replace a brass spigot with a stainless steel one on the sample port. And then we also prohibited sodium hydroxide as a process ingredient in light of the saponification finding. And we also limited them to just using potassium hydroxide only. The effluent would still essentially be a soap, but it wouldn't harden to an almost solid state when traveling through the sewer. The consistency would be more like a liquid dish soap, and we also instructed the facility to adjust pH closer to mimic the average value of domestic sewage, and to process a deceased person who represented the average weight and height for the Portland area to get a sample that would resemble the average effluent. The facility resampled after completing the guidelines the city supplied, and the significant findings were BOD significantly lowered, TSS increased quite a bit, but zinc and copper were underneath the local limits. We knew that oil and grease were going to be extremely high, but the EPA-approved method of hexane extraction is not capable of differentiating between oil and grease and soap. The oil and grease sample from the Florida facility had a value of about 1,200 milligrams per liter using that approved EPA method. There's currently no method that can differentiate between the two. Levels are always going to be high and outside of the permit range, and it can't be written as an exclusion of the discharge authorization or permit. The facility's biologists argued that other facilities like the Mayo Clinic use NaOH without any difficulty, but the effluent is constantly mixing and moving with high flows of wastewater that typically come from a hospital or a research facility, and they're not getting the same chance to build up in the sewer as it would with a concentrated point source. Since solids should not be found in a discharge, a separator is not required. City of Portland's pretreatment program has a smaller program for specific industry types that potentially pose risk to our assets as a whole group or individually that do not meet the criteria for a traditional permit. And industry has issued a discharge authorization under the guidelines and requirements outlined in their BMP certification. The industry submits a signed certification acknowledging they are following those BMPs along with any annual reporting that is associated with it. Under the BMPs, the facility is required to continuously monitor and adjust pH of processed wastewater with the limits. They are also required to maintain a log detailing the method of analysis, pH value, date, volume, and the duration of the batch discharge. They were also required to install a monitoring access structure outside of the facility to allow unrestricted access for city sampling and to keep staff out of the process areas that may be sensitive to view. All right. So the facility installed a stainless steel spigot from the tank to the other side of the wall. This allows city employees to collect a representative sample from a secure sampling point that's free from process areas. I also recommended a lock in case someone felt the urge to drink hose water.
Yeah.
It's difficult to promote a common BOD and suspended solids count just because each supplier has conducted their own testing, and these results can differ depending on the uniqueness of their system and their methods. Variations of methods include less caustic and longer exposure time, more caustic and less time, and less caustic with agitation. The results will also vary depending on the size and the fat content of the person. There are only 2 companies with commercial machines in the US, and they are pretty competitive with each other. The Bio-Cremation machine itself starts at about $300,000 and can go up to about $500,000 depending on what additions they want to add to it. Fire cremation device starts at about $150,000 plus maintenance, filter, and permit fees. Bio-Cremation does not require funeral homes and crematoria to obtain air emission permits from local agencies. The process consumes about 1/8 of the energy, while costing the consumer about the same as a traditional fire cremation. No metals are concentrated in the bio-cremation ash, where flame cremation produces a residue that's classified as toxic waste. Bio-cremation is an environmentally friendly method of biodisposition that uses the least amount of resources, and it generates the least amount of waste. The funeral business generates $17 billion a year, and a little over 2.5 billion people die each year in the United States. Half of those people are cremated, and that statistic is a bit higher in Oregon, so closer to about 75% choose cremation. It's by far the fastest growing sector in this industry, and in time, water cremation will likely outpace fire cremation as the consumer becomes more educated and comfortable on the subject. So there were some amendments that were introduced in January of 2019 for the Senate bill that adds alkaline hydrolysis and recomposition as allowable reduction methods for handling deceased person's body for their disposition. It provides licensing and inspection regulations for reduction facilities, and the amendments also update statutes governing the disposition of human remains and facilities offering those services to include alkaline hydrolysis and recomposition. They replace the term recomposition and recomposition facility with natural organic reduction and natural organic reduction facility. The bill essentially just includes the body composting that everyone's been kind of talking about recently that's happening in Seattle. If you were going to do any land application of any of that for fertilizer, it probably would be up to the state's agricultural agency. And they added a definition for scattered garden, which is just a designated area in a cemetery where somebody can go and just, spread ash around. And here's kind of the more you know section of the presentation to give disposition broader view and context. A few states prohibit home burial or require permits to do so, and most states allow home burial with restrictions and BMPs around storage. So the BMPs are around storage, time frame of death to burial, the receptacle, local zoning laws, contagious diseases, anything that you might need to consider before putting a body into the ground. You can find your state's home burial laws fairly easily, and you do have to apply for permission with the property owner or agency. I included a link to the burial at sea of non-cremated and cremated names for the curious, just because I didn't even know that there were regulations around that. And for Washington, bodies must be buried in an established cemetery. Bombing is not required, and refrigeration can be used until the time of burial or cremation. A casket is also not required for burial or cremation. In some cases, you can remove cremated remains without a permit. Oregon does allow this. Other states require transit permits. And so there are green cemeteries in most states where you can do direct burial with or without a biodegradable casket. You could also donate your body for research and education, and you're likely to end up in the hands of a forensics or medical student. If you have a current medical condition, diagnosis, your body could help for their treatments and general understanding of a very specific disease. Remains from this process are sent to a traditional processing facility where they're typically incinerated. The mushroom suit's a mycelium jumpsuit that's branded as the Infinity Burial Suit. It harnesses the power of the natural decomposers and it relies on the power of microremediation to neutralize contaminants in the body, like heavy metals and pesticides. Burial pod's an egg-shaped pod made from potato and corn starches, where the body is placed in a fetal position and then draped with cloth of natural fibers. The gradually decomposing body then feeds a tree that's usually planted right above it. The tree urn is also a biodegradable urn that turns your ashes into a tree, which is a pretty popular choice in Portland and runs you about $400. The latest method of reduction is cremation, which was developed by a Swedish biologist. It's kind of interesting, seems pretty high tech. I don't know if this will catch on. It uses liquid nitrogen to supercool the body to negative 196 degrees Celsius, crystallizing remains, and then they shatter it with an ultrasonic vibration and then freeze dry it. And it turns to compost when buried in a small biodegradable container. The concept focuses on letting natural decomposition take place, and I kind of thought of astronaut food when I read about this method, and I do feel like they missed a marketing opportunity to call it the flavor saver. The cremation company argues that the company in Seattle what they want to do with body composting is going to support new life, and instead it will produce methane in a rotting metabolic process, and there won't be any living soil as an end result. There are a few other options like having yourself pressed into a diamond or variations of what's listed here, as well as give your pets the same post-mortem processing. There's already a couple of Etsy shops that make blown glass pennants infused with cremated remains, so you might run into some competition if that was an idea that you were having. And I kind of want to close with a little PSA here. There's plenty of eco-friendly options where you aren't leaving a large footprint on the earth. If you haven't already done so, I recommend writing an advanced medical directive and writing down your own wishes for final disposition so that someone else doesn't have to make that decision for you. And I included a page with a bunch of links to the things I was referencing if anybody wants those. And here's the questions.
Questions?
Most of us might be at a loss for questions.
It is a lot of information at once. I did kind of machine gun it at you, so I'm sorry about that.
All right, who's the last chance? All right, well, thanks, Rachel, again. So yeah, we're a little bit early, but we can get started for lunch. Our appetites now.